5. The dog weighed 94 pounds of trained muscle and fury, and he had his teeth 6 inches from a doctor's throat before anyone in the emergency room understood what was happening. 5. The handler was unconscious on the stretcher, bleeding from 3 wounds, and the Belgian Malinois standing over him had already put 2 security guards on the floor. 5. Had their weapons drawn. The ER had gone completely unnaturally silent, the kind of silence that precedes either a miracle or a catastrophe. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, and then a 26-year-old nurse in blue scrubs walked directly into the kill zone alone, and nobody could stop her in time. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where I want you. Follow this channel. So you don't miss a single part, hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night had started the way bad nights in trauma care always did, not with one catastrophic event, but with a slow accumulation of everything going wrong at once. Hargrove Memorial Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Spokane, Washington, close enough to the interstate that the sound of highway traffic filtered through the walls on quiet nights, and close enough to the military installation at Fairchild Air Force Base that the ER staff had long since learned to recognize the particular kind of injuries that came in wearing tactical gear. The hospital wasn't the largest in the state, but its trauma unit had a reputation built over 20 years by a rotating cast of surgeons and nurses who stayed too long because the work got into your blood whether you wanted it to or not. On the night of October 14th, the trauma bay was already running at capacity before 9 o'clock. A construction accident on Route 2 had brought in 4 patients within the first hour of the evening shift. Cardiac arrest in the waiting room had pulled 2 of the senior nurses away from their assigned stations. On call, attending Dr. Garrett Miles, was in the middle of a chest closure when the radio crackled with the notification that changed everything inbound critical trauma. ETA 4 minutes, special operations personnel, active K9 unit, on scene and traveling with the patient. Ellie Navarro heard the radio call from the supply corridor, where she'd been restocking wound care kits. And she felt the specific kind of dread that every trauma nurse develops after enough years, the kind that tells you before any information arrives that this situation is going to be different from the other situations. She was 26 years old and had been working at Hargrove Memorial for 8 months. 8 months wasn't long in trauma nursing terms, and the staff had a way of reminding her of that without ever saying it directly. She was assigned the lower acuity rooms. She was pulled to assist, not to lead. The charge nurses called her Carter when they were in a good mood and the new one when they weren't. She didn't fight it. She showed up on time. She did her job carefully. She asked clarifying questions that sometimes annoyed people and sometimes saved them from mistakes, and she kept her head down. That was the plan. Keep her head down, do good work, draw attention. The ambulance bay doors slammed open at 9:47. The paramedics were moving fast, and Ellie could hear them before she could see them, the clipped, pressured language of people managing multiple problems simultaneously. She positioned herself near the trauma bay entrance, ready to assist wherever she was directed. What came through the doors wasn't what she expected, and she had stopped expecting things to be what she expected them to be a long time ago. The man on the stretcher was in his late 30s, large-framed, with the kind of muscle density that comes from years of physical discipline rather than a gym. He was unconscious, his face gray beneath the dried blood, wearing the stripped-down remnants of tactical clothing that had been partially cut away by the paramedics. 3 distinct wound sites left the right side of the torso and a laceration across the shoulder that had been field-dressed with material that wasn't standard medical gauze. Beside him, moving with the stretcher in a way that made the paramedics visibly uncomfortable, was the dog, a Belgian Malinois male. Somewhere around 4 or 5 years old based on his build, though his eyes looked older than that in the way working dogs' eyes sometimes do. He was on a lead attached to the stretcher frame, but the lead was purely symbolic. The animal wasn't being restrained by the physical tether. He was choosing to stay connected to the man on the stretcher, and everyone in the room understood on some instinctive level that the distinction mattered. The dog's coat was mostly dark fawn with a black mask, and there was a scar, a significant one, healed but unmistakable, that ran from the outer corner of his left eye down toward his jaw. A check mark, drawn by something that had meant to do permanent damage. I saw the scar from 20 feet away, and something inside her chest went absolutely still. She didn't move, she didn't make a sound. She stood exactly where she was and watched and breathed and kept her face neutral the way she had trained herself to do years before she ever set foot in a nursing program. I called charge nurse Donna Reyes, already directing traffic. Dr. Miles out of OR 2. Somebody page Whitfield for consult. The dog needs to be secured, said one of the paramedics, a heavy-set man named Birch, whose voice had the flat quality of someone who had already made this argument several times in the last 4 minutes. He was fine in the vehicle, but he's been escalating since we got inside. As if to confirm this, the Malinois let out a low, sustained growl that stopped 3 nurses mid-step. We have animal control on the way. How long? 5 minutes. Maybe 30. Birch shook his head. That dog is military trained. He's been with this guy through whatever happened tonight, and he's in a protection posture. You try to separate them right now, and you're going to have a problem. We already have a problem, Ray said, and there was no argument to be made against that. They transferred the patient to the trauma bay gurney, with the dog still attached to the stretcher frame, and then Birch unclipped the lead from the stretcher and, before anyone could stop him or think better of it, clipped it instead to the gurney rail. The Malinois moved with the transfer like he'd done it before, smooth, controlled, watching everything. What's the handler's name? Ellie asked. She was asking Birch, keeping her voice low, and even looked at her like he was noticing her for the first time. Staff Sergeant Damon Kowalski. That's all we were given. Hawkins. The team that called it in was they weren't exactly chatty. What's the dog's name? Tag say Gunner. Ellie looked at the dog. Eyes. The scar on his face was on the left side, running from the eye toward the jaw. She had last seen that scar 7 years ago in a forward operating base in a country whose name she was not going to think about in the middle of a trauma bay, and the dog had been 18 months old, and his name had not been Gunner. She turned and went to get gloves and draw her assignment, because this was not the time, and she was very good at deciding when things were and were not the time. Dr. Miles arrived from OR2 still wearing a partial scrub set, and Ellie watched him take in the scene with the particular expression of a man who had not been warned about the dog and was now recalculating everything. Situation. He said to no one specifically. Reyes gave him the rundown in 30 seconds: patient injuries, vitals, canine ETA on animal control. Miles processed it while pulling on gloves, his eyes moving between the chart and the patient and the dog in the way of someone doing rapid triage on 3 separate problems at once. Okay, he said. Somebody get security up here. We need a perimeter around this bay while we work. Already called, said Reyes. And the dog needs to come off that gurney. Animal control is. I heard you. I'm not waiting 20 minutes with a military working dog in my trauma bay while my patient is bleeding out. Off the gurney. This was when the security guards made their first attempt, and it lasted approximately 11 seconds. The larger of the 2 guards, a man named Fitch, who was genuinely trying to do his job, professionally approached the gurney from the left side with a catch pole extended. The Malinois tracked his movement with the patience of an animal that has been trained to wait for the exact right moment, and when Fitch got within 4 feet of the gurney rail, the dog lunged. He didn't bite, not quite, but he got his teeth within inches of Fitch's forearm, and the sound he made was not a sound that anyone in that room would forget quickly. Fitch stumbled backward and knocked into a crash cart, and the second guard grabbed his arm and pulled him out of the bay. And for a long moment, everyone stood at the perimeter of the trauma bay and looked at the dog and the unconscious man and understood that the situation had just become significantly more complicated. Nobody goes near that gurney, Miles said, and his voice had changed tighter with an edge that Ellie recognized as controlled anger. Not anger at the dog. Anger at circumstances that were making it impossible to do his job. Get me Kowalski's vitals from the monitor, Carter. You're on the outside of this. Prep the crash cart. Doctor. She started on the crash cart. She was also watching the dog. His behavior had a pattern to it she'd been watching since the ambulance bay, cataloging it without seeming to. Every time someone moved toward the gurney or spoke loudly, his alertness spiked. Every time the activity around him decreased, he oriented back to the patient, and something in his posture dropped exactly but present. Backwards. Instead of outward, he was protecting, not aggressing. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously. But nobody in this room had the particular kind of experience required to read that distinction under pressure. And Ellie was not going to say so because she had made a decision years ago about what parts of her life she was going to keep separate. That decision was getting harder to maintain by the minute. Husky's oxygen saturation dropped to 88 on the monitor, and Miles made a sharp sound. I need to get to that patient. Somebody figure out the dog situation right now. Yes. Was on the phone from across the bay. Ellie could hear her end of the conversation. She was talking to someone in administration, or possibly hospital security command. And the conversation had the circular quality of 2 people trying to solve a problem that neither of them had authority to solve. The police arrived at 9:59, two officers, both in uniform, who had apparently been called by security when the guards were pushed back. The older of the two, a sergeant named Decker, based on his tag, surveyed the scene with the expression of a man who was going to have to write a very unusual report tonight. "What's the status?" he asked Miles. "My patient is crashing and I cannot access him because of the dog. I need that animal secured or removed." Decker looked at the Malinois. Malinois looked back at him. "We can't shoot him in a hospital," the younger officer said somewhat unnecessarily. "Ivan, nobody is shooting the dog," Miles said, with a sharpness that suggested this was not the first time tonight he'd had to say something obvious. "Animal control. Is 20 minutes." I know. Miles turned to Reyes. "Is there anyone at all who has experience with working dogs, military, law enforcement, anything?" Eyes looked around the room. People looked at the floor, or at each other, or at the monitor readings. Nobody raised a hand. Ellie was working on the crash cart. She did not raise her hand. She kept her eyes on what she was doing and breathed. Husky's heart rate was dropping 88 on the monitor. Pressure was falling. The field dressings on his thigh wound were failing. She could see it from where she stood, the dark spread of blood through the material, and nobody could get close enough to intervene. Baker said, "If we can't clear the animal, we may have to consider." "Don't, Miles," said Doctor. "If the patient—" I said, "Don't," but Miles's voice had the particular quality of a man running out of options, and everyone in the room could hear it. He set down the defibrillator pads she'd been checking. She'd run the calculation 17 different ways in the last 8 minutes, and she kept getting the same answers, and she didn't like the answer, but she kept getting it. "Dr. Miles," she said. He didn't look at her. "Not now, Carter." I need 30 seconds of your attention, Doctor." The flatness of her tone made him turn. It surprised him. She could see that. 8 months of keeping her voice soft and her requests small, and something in the way she'd just spoken had cut through the noise. He said, "I can get the dog off the gurney." Silence. Not the silence of people considering her statement, the silence of people deciding how to dismiss it efficiently. "I'm not asking permission," Ellie said. "I'm informing you of what I'm going to do, so that when I approach the gurney, your security staff doesn't grab me and cause a secondary incident." Elle stared at her. "You're a trauma nurse with 8 months of experience. That dog just put a certified security officer on the floor. If he bites you, we're down another person, and I have one patient bleeding out and no ability to reach him." "I understand the math, Doctor." "Then you understand why the answer is no." She looked at him, really looked at him the way she had learned to look at people who were making decisions from incomplete information, said his oxygen status at 82. "That field dressing on his thigh is failing. You have approximately 4 minutes before you lose him to hemorrhagic shock, and animal control is still 15 minutes out." She paused. "The answer is still no." Miles had tightened around them. Everyone had gone very quiet. "That dog bites you," he said finally. "You're not my problem." "We Crystal," she said, and turned toward the gurney. Sergeant Decker put his hand on her arm as she passed. Not hard. A question more than a stop. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. This was low, meant only for her. "I know this dog," she said. And then before he could process that, she moved past him and into the bay. She didn't rush. Rushing was wrong. Rushing would tell the Malinois that something was wrong, and he was already reading everything in this room and categorizing it. She walked with deliberate slowness, her hands loose at her sides, her shoulders down, her gaze dropped slight, not submissive, not dominant. Something more specific than either of those things. She breathed out through her nose, slow and even. The dog tracked her from the moment she crossed the bay threshold. He came up from his position beside the gurney, not a full stand, more of a coiled readiness, a spring that has been compressed and fixed her with the particular attention that military working dogs develop. It wasn't aggression yet. It was assessment. She stopped 6 feet from the gurney and crouched down, making herself smaller, and she looked at the floor just to the left of the dog rather than directly at him. "Hey," she said quietly, just the word, no performance in it. The dog's ears moved a small thing, almost nothing. She reached into the chest pocket of her scrubs slowly with no sudden motion and withdrew a challenge coin, metal worn smooth. She set it on the floor between them. The Malinois' nose worked. His head dropped slightly, and she could see him taking in the scent of the coin, and beneath that her scent, and she understood that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds was going to happen on terms she couldn't fully control. She had done everything she could do from the outside. The rest was up to what the dog remembered. She said quietly in a voice she hadn't used in 7 years, one word in a language that was not English and was not the language of any country she'd officially served in. "Heimkom." I'm. Come home. The Malinois went stillness of an animal preparing to attack. A different stillness, the kind that looks like the whole body is listening to something. The ears can't quite catch. She said it again, same word, same voice, and she let her breath go completely soft. The way she'd learned in places she'd never talk about, the way you had to go completely quiet inside yourself when the situation required it. The dog took one step toward her, then another, and then he walked the remaining distance and put his head under her hand. And the sound he made was not a growl and not a whine, but something between the two, the sound of an animal that has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. Behind her, somebody said Jesus Christ in a voice barely above a breath. She stroked the dog's head once, twice, her hand steady. Then she unclipped the lead from the gurney rail, moved him back 3 steps toward the wall, and looked over her shoulder at Miles. He'll stay with me, she said. Go. Miles was already moving. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos, which was the only kind of chaos that produced good outcomes. Miles got to Kowalski within seconds of her clearing the gurney, and what he found was bad but workable. The thigh wound had nicked the femoral but hadn't severed it. The torso wound was a through-and-through that had missed the major structures by a margin that Miles will later risk as embarrassingly close, and the shoulder laceration needed a significant amount of repair, but was not immediately life-threatening. What had been killing Kowalski was blood loss, and blood loss was something this trauma bay knew how to fight. Stood with the dog at the far wall and watched and did not move and did not say anything. She had one hand on the Malinois's back. He was pressed against her leg, still vigilant, still watching the activity around the gurney, but his breathing had slowed and his posture had shifted from the coiled readiness of before into something that was closer to a working rest. Watching but no longer calculating whether everything in the room was a threat around her. People moved and spoke and did their jobs, and she was aware that many of them were also watching her, in the way that humans watch something that has not been explained to them yet, and that therefore feels slightly threatening. Eyes came to stand near her at one point, not close enough to disturb the dog, and said quietly, "You want to tell me what that was?" "Not right now, Ellie," said Carter. "Not right now, Donna." Eyes looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to coordinating the trauma response, and Ellie stood at the wall with the dog and kept her face neutral and felt the weight of the choice she'd just made settling into her bones. She had kept herself invisible for 8 months. She had been careful and deliberate, and she had built exactly the kind of unremarkable professional identity she had needed in order to do this work without the past following her into every room. 8 months of being overlooked. 8 months of being called the new one and handed the low-acuity assignments and dismissed in rounds and told to stay out of it when the interesting cases came through. And then a dog with a scar on his face had come through those doors, and she'd done the math. And here she was. Husky's vitals stabilized at 10:31. Miles called it out to the room, and there was the collective exhale that trauma teams do when the balance tips from one side to the other, and for about 4 seconds, everyone in the bay simply breathed. Then Miles turned and looked at her, not at the dog. At her. "Carter," he said. His voice had changed again. The clipped authority was still there, but underneath it was something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the particular unease of a man who has just realized that his understanding of a situation was significantly incomplete. Office after handoff. "Yes, doctor," she said. He turned back to his patient, and Ellie looked down at the dog beside her, and the dog looked back up at her. And she thought about everything she'd spent 7 years building distance from, and understood that the distance she'd built, some of it had just collapsed. 11:15. Kowalski was in the surgical suite for repair work on the femoral, and the trauma bay had returned to the background noise of a busy night shift. Animal control had arrived 23 minutes late and had taken one look at the dog, sitting calmly beside Ellie, and had nothing useful to contribute. Reyes told them in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. 2 men in civilian clothes arrived at 11:22. They came through the side entrance, not the main ER doors, and spoke to Reyes in voices low enough that Ellie couldn't hear from across the room. She watched their posture and the way they moved and the particular way they scanned the room upon entering. Not the way patients' families scan or the way administrators scan, and she knew exactly what kind of men they were before they got anywhere near her. Eyes pointed toward her, and both men looked across the room and saw her standing with the dog, and the younger one said something to the older one that Ellie couldn't read from that distance. They walked toward her with measured steps. The Malinois felt it. She felt his posture shift before she registered consciously What had changed the slight stiffen along the fractional lift of his head. But he didn't vocalize. He stayed pressed to her leg and watched them come. Nice. Nurse Carter, the older man said. He was somewhere in his late 40s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor time rather than age. That's me, she said. He reached into his jacket slowly, the way people do when they're aware of the dog, and produced credentials. Department of Defense. She didn't read the rest carefully enough to catch the specific unit. My name is Harlan Voss, he said. This is my colleague Derek Sato, here, about Staff Sergeant Kowalski and the K9. He paused. And we have some questions about how you cleared the animal. I'm sure you do, she said. We were briefed that the dog's previous designation was a call sign that has been classified for the past 5 years. He was watching her face carefully. And the command you used isn't any public canine training manual. No, she said, it isn't. Voss was quiet for a moment. Dog's ears had shifted, tracking the conversation, reading the tension in it, deciding. Miss Carter, Voss said, and his tone had shifted slightly. The official quality pulled back just a fraction, replaced by something more direct. We're going to need you to help us understand who you are. She looked at him. She looked at Sato. She looked at the dog, who was looking at the two men with the patient, calculating attention of an animal who has survived by reading people correctly. I know, she said. And she'd known this was coming from the moment she'd made the decision to walk across that trauma bay floor, and she had made the decision anyway, because the math didn't leave another answer, and she was going to have to live with what came next. Giles was in the hallway watching. Reyes was watching. 3 of the nurses who'd been on shift were watching. Even Decker, the police sergeant who had stayed on beyond the resolution of the incident in the way that people sometimes do when they can't quite make themselves leave. Something that isn't finished yet, he was watching. Ellie looked back at Voss. Let me check in with the charge nurse, she said. And then I'll tell you what I can. She had said what I can, not everything. And Voss caught the distinction because men like Voss always caught distinctions like that. And he nodded once, the slight nod of a person receiving information that confirms something they suspected. She turned toward the nurse's station, and the dog moved with her, step for step. He'd been doing it his whole life. 3. A surgeon was rebuilding the damaged structures in Damon Kowalski's thigh, and the machines were showing stable readings, and the patient who had almost died in the trauma bay was going to live through the night. That was the part that mattered. That was always the part that mattered. But Ellie Carter understood, walking across that floor with the dog at her side, and the eyes of everyone in the department on her back, that the life she had spent 8 months constructing quiet, ordinary, deliberately unremarkable had just ended. And she was not ready for what was coming, but she had stopped being ready for things a long time ago, and she had learned that readiness was mostly a story people told themselves. You actually did when things went wrong, that was the part that counted. She was about to find out how many people in this building were going to believe her when she told them who she was. She had stopped being ready for things a long time ago, and she had learned that readiness was mostly a story people told themselves. You actually did when things went wrong, that was the part that counted. She was about to find out how many people in this building were going to believe her when she told them who she was. The nurse's station smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer, and Donna Reyes was standing behind the counter with a tablet in her hands and an expression on her face that said she was done, pretending the last 2 hours had been normal. Giles. Want you in his office in 10 minutes, Reyes said before Ellie could speak. And those two, she tilted her head toward Voss and Sato, who had stopped a respectful distance away and were conducting a quiet conversation between themselves. Have been here before, or people like them. DoD badges, civilian clothes show up, after something happens that they won't explain. Fine. No, Ellie said. Reyes set the tablet down. You used a German command on a classified military working dog, and the dog folded like you'd known each other for years. You want to tell me what's going on, or do I have to piece it together from the incident report? The incident report isn't going to cover most of it. That's what I figured. Reyes looked at her for a long moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular focused attention of a woman who had been in charge of people long enough to know when someone was carrying weight they hadn't disclosed. Are you in trouble? The question was direct enough that it caught Ellie slightly off guard. Not the kind of off guard that showed on her face, but the kind she felt in her chest, the small jolt of being seen by some since I wasn't supposed to be looking. Not the kind you mean, she said. Reyes picked up the tablet again. 10 minutes, she said, and that was the end of the conversation. Ellie turned and found Voss at her shoulder. He'd moved while she was talking to Reyes, quiet enough that the dog had tracked him but not sounded off. We can wait, Voss said, but I want you to know we're not here about you. We're here about Kowalski and the extraction, and about who brought him in without going through proper channels. You happen to be adjacent to the situation, I'm aware, she said. But you're also not nothing, he said, and the bluntness of it was almost refreshing. Because nobody who is nothing uses that command. She looked at him. Is the sergeant going to make it through surgery? Early indications are good, then whatever you need from me can wait until he's stable and I've finished my shift. She said it without hostility, just information. The same way she had told Miles she was going to approach the gurney. Here is what is accordingly. Voss blinked. Then very slightly he nodded. She walked to Miles's office and the dog walked with her. Garrett Miles's office was the kind of space that accumulated, rather than organized stacked journals, 2 half-empty coffee mugs, a whiteboard with old differential diagnoses that hadn't been erased, of a family photograph that faced away from the desk at an angle, suggesting it had been moved and not moved back. He was behind the desk when she knocked, and he waved her in without looking up from whatever he was reading. The dog came in behind her, and that made Miles look up. He goes where I go right now, Ellie said, until Kowalski is out of surgery. Separating them isn't a good idea. That's not fine. Miles set down the paper. Sit down, Carter. She sat. The dog sat beside her, pressed against her knee. Miles looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the trauma bay, that recalibration process that was still ongoing, the slow revision of a picture he'd built over 8 months. She'd seen it on people's faces before. It was never entirely comfortable. You want to explain what happened out there, he said. I recognized the dog from where she'd made a decision in the hallway about how much to say, how much to frame, how much to let lie fallow for now. I served. She said before nursing school. I was attached to a medical support unit for about 4 years. I crossed paths with that K-9 team during a training rotation. Miles was quiet. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes shifted, the piece of information landing and being sorted. Kind of unit, he said. The kind that doesn't show up in standard personnel directories. There's silence. He picked up a pen and set it down again without using it. You have a nursing license, a clean background check, and 8 months of solid if unremarkable work. I didn't flag anything unusual in your file. My previous service record is not in the standard accessible database, she said. That's not concealment, doctor. That's how classification works. And you didn't disclose any of this when you were hired. I disclosed that I had prior medical training and experience in field triage. I wasn't asked about the circumstances. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way of a man running through implications. Does this have anything to do with why you specifically requested the night shift and the lower acuity assignments when you started? She hadn't expected that question, which meant she respected him slightly more for asking it. I wanted a transition period, she said, from one kind of work to another. That's diplomatic. It's accurate. He looked at her for a long moment. The 2 men outside. I don't know them specifically. What they are. And what are they? They're from whatever unit Kowalski belongs to or adjacent to it. They want to understand how the dog got into this hospital with an injured handler and no official notification, and they want to make sure I'm not a liability to whatever Kowalski was doing before he ended up in my trauma bay. Miles tapped his fingers on the desk. 1, 2, 3. Are you? No, she said. He looked at her, then he said, okay. And she understood that he meant it not blind trust, but a provisional acceptance of the situation that he was going to have to revise later with more information. It was a reasonable response, and she appreciated it. I need to finish my shift, she said. You need to talk to those men. After my shift, Carter. He leaned forward. I'm not trying to push you into anything. But whatever happened tonight, the dog, the command, those credentials, it's not going to disappear, because we go back to treating chest compressions and lacerations. Fine. No, she said, I'm not trying to make it disappear. I'm trying to manage the pace. He studied her for another few seconds. Then he nodded. Finish your shift, but those men need something from you before midnight, or they're going to escalate to hospital administration, and then it becomes my problem in a different way. Understood, she said, and stood. And the dog stood with her. She was almost at the door when Miles said, Carter. She turned. Good catch on the satin, the field dressing, he said. Timing was you had it. Right, 4 minutes was about what he had. Once, then she went back to work. The next 2 hours were professionally straightforward and personally excruciating. She traced a broken radius, assisted on a laceration repair that needed more layers than it initially appeared. checked in on 2 of the construction accident patients who had been moved to monitoring status, and did all of it with a military working dog ghosting her steps through the department and 2 Department of Defense investigators sitting in the family waiting area with bad coffee and patient expressions. The staff had stopped pretending not to watch her. That was new, or rather it was new in a specific way. Before tonight she had been invisible, and invisible had been fine. Had been the goal. Eyes had been exactly what she'd needed. Now she was visible, and the quality of the attention was different from what she'd expected. It wasn't hostile, exactly. It was more like reassessment. People were quietly going back through 8 months of interactions and running them through a new filter. The security guard the dog had nearly bitten stopped her near the elevator at 11:40. "Hi," he said. He had gauze on his forearm where the dog's teeth had grazed the skin. Nothing serious, but I'm not mad. The dog. "I want you to know that." "Okay," she said. "Hi. Just how did you do that?" He had me cold. "I've worked with K9 units before, patrol dogs, and I have never seen an animal go from that to." He gestured toward the dog, who was sitting calmly at her heel, watching Fitch with polite attention. He was protecting, she said, not attacking. There's a difference, and once you're reading the right signal, the response changes. Fitch looked at the dog. The dog looked at Fitch. Something almost like a mutual understanding passed between them, which was probably Ellie's imagination, but felt real. "What's his name?" Fitch asked. "His working tick says Gunner," she said. And then because she was tired. "People sometimes say things they're managing carefully," she said. "But that's not what he was called when I knew him." I looked at her. "Never mind," she said and moved on. At 12:15, she found a quiet corner near the supply corridor and made a call. Number was old, 7 years old, and she wasn't entirely certain it would still be active, but it rang twice and then connected to a voicemail that gave a name she recognized and instructions for leaving a secure message. She kept it short, 7 seconds, maybe 8. Then she hung up and stood in the supply corridor with the dog and breathed. Fine. No, she told him, it wasn't nothing talking to a dog like he understood. He probably understood more than most of the people in this building. Fine. I know I didn't want this either. He pressed his nose briefly against her hand. She went back to work at 12:49. Voss found her in the medication prep area. Husky's out of surgery. "That," said stable surgeon, "says he'll keep the leg." Thanks. "Good, he's asking for the dog." She looked at Voss. Conscious already briefly. He came up enough to ask 2 things: whether his team was clear and where Gunner was. Voss paused. "The dog was with a nurse," he said, and I'm quoting, "which nurse?" We didn't have a good answer. "You can tell him the dog is fine," she said. "Tell him Gunner found the right person." Voss was studying her with the careful attention she'd noticed when he first approached her. Not suspicious. Professionally thorough, Miss Carter. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've been in situations where someone did something they shouldn't have been able to do, and I've learned that those situations always have a history. I'm not here to create problems for you. I'm here to understand what happened and make sure the right people are protected." "That sounds like a practice speech," she said. "It is," he said, without any particular embarrassment. Also true. She closed the medication prep drawer and turned to face him fully. "What do you already know? That your nursing school records are clean. Your employment history before nursing school has a gap of 4 years with no public documentation. The command you used tonight is specific to one training program that has not officially existed since 2018. And that the dog whose working designation prior to his current assignment was not Gunner responded to you like he'd been waiting for you to show up." She held his gaze. "That's a thorough briefing for 12 hours after the incident. I made some calls on the drive over." He paused. "Someone you know called someone I know about 40 minutes ago. That's actually why I'm coming to you now rather than waiting." The number had still been active, and whoever had received the voicemail had moved faster than she'd anticipated. "Called you," she said. "It was barely a question." I can't give you that name in this building," he said. "I can tell you that the call was short and specific, and the person vouched for you at a level that is not common. And that the questions I need to ask you have changed considerably from the questions I arrived here with." She was quiet. The dog leaned against her leg. "There's a conference room on the 2nd floor," she said finally. "Administrative wing. It'll be empty at this hour. Give me 15 minutes to finish a medication round and I'll meet you there." 15 minutes, he said, and stepped back, and she turned to finish her work and felt the walls of the careful, ordinary life she'd built beginning to breathe, expanding, contracting, taking on a new shape that she couldn't fully see yet. The conference room was cold in the specific way of rooms that have been air-conditioned without consideration for human beings actually sitting in them. Otto had found a notepad from somewhere. Voss had two phones on the table in front of him, both face down. The dog settled under the table at Ellie's feet and appeared to go to sleep, which she knew was not actually sleep, but the working rest of an animal that trusted the situation enough to conserve energy. She told them what she could tell them in the order it needed to be told. She had enlisted at 19. She had been selected for advanced medical training at 21, and from there had been assigned to a small unit whose function she described as surgical support for high-risk extraction operations, which was accurate and also deeply incomplete, but she was not going to fill in the gaps for two men she'd met 4 hours ago. She had served 4 years, she had left at 25, and the leaving had been. She paused here, choosing words complicated. Dog. Voss said his designation when I knew him was different, she said. He was part of a two-dog team assigned to the unit I supported. His handler at that time was a staff sergeant named She stopped. I don't know what name is safe to use in this context. Sense. You can use first names, Voss said. We're not recording. Voss' pen was moving. She glanced at it. He's not recording, Voss said. He takes notes by hand, force of habit. His handler's name was Rowan, she said. First name. I don't know what name he's operating under now, or what happened to his file after the unit restructured. Athens. Something shifted in Voss's expression, minor controlled, but she caught it. Rowan, he said. Voss looked at Sato. Sato looked at the notepad. She said. Staff Sergeant Kowalski's full name. Voss said. Carefully. Damon Rowan Kowalski. The conference room was very quiet for a moment. She had been looking at his face when they brought him in, and it had been gray with blood loss and unconsciousness, and she had been focused on the dog and the wound sites and the math of time against blood pressure. And she had not looked closely enough to take the injury. Her voice came out level. It was the only thing she had that was level right now. What was the nature of the operation that led to the injury? I genuinely cannot tell you in this room, Voss said. I can tell you that Sergeant Kowalski has been running operations adjacent to our office for the past 8 months, and that we have been trying for approximately 6 of those 8 months to locate someone whose service filed in 2018 under a classification protocol that I am only marginally cleared to access. She understood what he was saying. She understood it with the precise, awful clarity of a person who has spent years being careful and has just discovered that the care was beside the point. You've been looking for me, she said, not actively. Not until recently. He leaned forward slightly. There's a situation that's developed. I can't brief you here, but it involves personnel from your former unit, and it involves records that were sealed. And it involves a man who survived something he shouldn't have survived and has been carrying information that he doesn't trust to go through standard channels. He paused. He trusted it to come here to this hospital without telling us why. What about that? Damon Rowan Kowalski lying in a recovery room, 1 floor below this one, who had come to this specific city and this specific hospital while bleeding from 3 wounds, with the dog they had both known, when all of them were different people in a different world. I was here, she said. It wasn't quite a question. That's what I believe. Yes, Voss said. She looked at the surface of the conference table. There was a ring from a coffee cup near the center, old and faint, somebody's long ago meeting bleeding through. She focused on it because it was easier than focusing on what she was currently understanding. What do you need from me, she said right now. Nothing. We need you to be reachable, and we need you to stay in the area, and we need, he hesitated, which was the first time she'd seen him hesitate. We need you to be willing to talk to Kowalski when he wakes up fully. Because whatever he came here to do, you're apparently part of it. I'm a trauma nurse, she said. Yes, Voss said, among other things. She sat with that for a moment, then she said, I want to see his chart. His full surgical report. You're not his assigned nurse. No, she said, but I'm the person who kept his dog from taking a bullet in my trauma bay, and I'm apparently the person he came to this hospital to find, so I think we can make some flexibility work. Voss looked at her. Then he said, I'll talk to the surgical team. She stood and the dog woke instantly and stood with her. She looked at the 2 men on the other side of the table and felt the full, uncomfortable weight of everything she'd been carrying since she walked into that trauma bay, and underneath the weight was something she hadn't expected to feel. Dread? Not exactly. Something closer to the particular feeling of a mission that has been waiting without your knowledge for you to be ready for it. She was not ready. She had told herself in the supply corridor that readiness was a story people told themselves, and she had meant it. But she had also meant it as a comfort, as a way of getting through the next hour, as a philosophy she was prepared to live by in the next several days. But Rowan was downstairs, and the dog was at her heel, and Voss was waiting for an answer to a question that hadn't quite been spoken yet. I'll be back on shift at 7, she said. Whatever you need from me before then, call the charge nurses station. They'll reach me.
She walked to the door. Behind her, Sato said, Ms.
Carter. She paused without turning the command used. Common. The dog handler who designed that protocol, the one who trained this unit's animals, died in 2019. Says training unknown program discontinued. You're the first person we've found in 3 years who knows that word. She kept her hand on the door frame. Then you should probably take good note, she said, and walked out. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful, not Voss or Sato. She turned. It was Donna Reyes, coming from the direction of the nursing station, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has just received information that has changed the shape of their evening. Carter, she said, you need to come back to the floor. What happened? Kowalski, Reyes said. He came up out of sedation about 10 minutes ago. They tried to keep him calm. Surgical team was in there, and he was fine. He was coherent until someone told him the 2 DOD men were in the building. Ellie went still, and he told the surgical nurse very clearly, very specifically, that he needed to see you. Not the DOD men. Not the on-call physician. Reyes paused. He said, and I'm going to get this right, because it was unusual. He said, tell the nurse with the dog that the package is still in play and she needs to know before Voss does. The corridor seemed to contract slightly. Package. Before Voss does whatever Rowan had brought to this hospital tonight, whatever information he was carrying that he didn't trust to standard channels, he hadn't told Voss what it was. He had come to Spokane, to this specific hospital, and he had come bleeding and barely conscious, and he had trusted the dog to find the right person. And now he was awake and asking for her, and Harlan Voss was 2 floors up in a conference room, without phones in hand, and she had maybe 10 minutes before someone told him that his patient was conscious and talking. Where's the surgical ward? She said 3rd floor, west wing. Carter, she was already moving. The dog fell into steps beside her without being asked, his nails quiet on the polished hospital floor. Body language, shifting into the particular focused alertness of an animal who has been waiting for the next phase of something, and has just been told it has arrived. The dog fell into step beside her without being asked, his nails quiet on the polished hospital floor. Body language, shifting into the particular focused alertness of an animal who has been waiting for the next phase of something, and has just been told it has arrived. The elevator was slow, and she took the 3rd floor wet. She'd been up here twice in 8 months, both times delivering chart updates that could have been sent electronically, but that the surgical ward's charge nurse, a meticulous woman named Brenda Ferris, preferred to receive in person. The ward had a different quality from the ER Queeter, obviously, but more than that, more contained. The urgency in the ER was horizontal, spreading across space, filling rooms. The urgency here moved vertically up and down through the layers of sedation and recovery, through the body's slow negotiation with what had been done to it. Eddie pushed through the stairwell door and turned west. A surgical nurse she didn't know by name intercepted her at the corridor intersection, clipboard in hand, with the expression of someone who had been asked to manage a situation they weren't fully briefed on. Asked Carter. Yes, Dr. Whitfield asked me. He's in with the patient, and he said, I'm going in, Ellie said and moved past her. She heard the nurse start to say something else, and then stop, and she understood that the particular quality of her voice, not aggressive, just absolute, had done the work, the same way it had done the work in the trauma bay. There were people who pushed back against authority, and people who simply moved through the space where authority was standing, and she had learned a long time ago which one required less energy. 318 had a single bed, a wall-mounted monitor showing stable vitals and IV pole, and 2 people who were already there when she entered. Dr. Whitfield, 50s, silver-haired, with the particular precise economy of movement that came from 3 decades of surgical work, was standing at the foot of the bed, reviewing something on a tablet. He looked up when Ellie came in and started to speak, and then he saw the dog and he stopped. The other person was in the bed. Rowan Kowalski looked significantly better than he had on the trauma bay gurney, which was a low bar, but he also looked like a man who had been through genuine hell and was currently negotiating a fragile truce with his own body. The gray was gone from his face, replaced by a dull, medicated pallor that was at least alive, and his eyes were open. Dark eyes, deeply set with the particular quality of alertness that doesn't quite disappear even under anesthesia. Large. Even horizontal, the muscle density she'd noticed in the trauma bay present, even in a hospital gown, though the left leg was elevated and braced, and the bandaging on his right side showed through the gap in the gown's neckline. Her. And the expression that crossed his face was not relief exactly, and not recognition exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both, the complicated emotional response of a person seeing someone they'd stopped expecting to see. Hates all, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation tube they'd had to place during surgery, and it came out in pieces. But the specific shortening of her name, nobody called her Elle, had never called her Elle except one unit, a group of people, in one particular chapter of her life landed in her chest like a thrown object. Hey, she said. The dog walked to the side of the bed and put his head on the mattress near Kowalski's hand, and Kowalski's fingers moved to the dog's ear without him looking down, automatic, the muscle memory of years. You're going to need to explain to me, Ellie said, why you came here. I will, he said. But first I need to know, did Voss talk to you? Yes, how much enough to raise more questions than he answered? Lately. What did he tell you? There's a situation involving personnel from the old unit. You came here without notifying his office that you're carrying information you don't trust to standard channels. She paused. And that they've been looking for someone with my background for 6 months. Husky looked at Whitfield. Dr. Whitfield set down the tablet. I'm going to pretend I have something to check at the nurse's station, he said, with the resigned pragmatism of a man who has been around enough to know when he's not supposed to be in a room. 15 minutes. Then I'm back in and we're having a conversation about pain management and rest, and I don't care who any of you are. Walked out. The door clicked. Ellie pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat. Kowalski watched her move, and she was aware that he was doing the same inventory she'd done on him, reading the years, reading what had changed. You look different, he said. 7 years, she said. Like someone shot you 3 times, it was rude. He shifted and winced, and tried not to show that he'd winced, which was so specifically him that it almost made her laugh. Listen, I need to go fast because I don't know how long before Voss figures out I'm awake. He'll know within the next 5 minutes, she said. Go fast, Kowalski told her, took 11 minutes. And by the end of it, she was sitting very still in the chair, with her hands in her lap, and her face doing nothing that she associated with situations where being slow was going to get someone killed. The unit they had served in, the one with the sealed files. The one whose training program Sato had said officially discontinued in 2018 had not entirely discontinued. A subset of personnel had been folded into a different structure, one with less oversight and considerably more operational latitude. Kowalski had been one of them. For 3 years, the work had been what they told him. It was high-risk extractions, protection of sensitive assets, the kind of work that moved fast and quiet and didn't generate paperwork. About a year ago, things had started to feel wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way he could put in a report or take to a superior. Wrong in the way that people who have been doing dangerous work for a long time learn to read in the gaps between orders and the destinations that didn't quite make sense, in the faces of the people they were extracting, who sometimes weren't the people they'd been told to extract. He'd started keeping personal records encrypted, stored in a location that wasn't connected to any official system. 6 months ago, one of the other personnel from the original unit, a woman named Vargas, whom Ellie remembered as precise and sardonic, and almost unfairly good under pressure, had surfaced briefly and told him that 2 other members of the old team had been killed. The official reports called them training accidents. Vargas didn't believe that, and once Kowalski looked at the records he'd been keeping, he didn't believe it either. Vargas is gone now too, he said 3 weeks ago. Classification accident, training incident, closed case. Listen, Ellie breathed in the information you're carrying. Documentation. I've got 3 years of operational records, including 2 missions where the targets were not who we were told they were, and including communications that show the directives were coming from inside the structure, not from the external command they were telling us was authorizing the operations. He paused. I've had it in a distributed system. 3 separate locations, 3 separate keys. One key is with me. One was with Vargas. When he looked at her, as with the person who designed the original unit's security protocols. She understood before he finished the sentence. That was Rowan Decker, she said. The name she'd been careful not to use in the conference room. The name that didn't appear in standard records, because the person who held it had operated under enough cover designations that his actual identity was a nested problem. Yeah, Kowalski is dead, has been for 2 years. Before he died, he gave his key to someone he trusted, and the name he left in the secure system was yours. I sat with that Rowan Decker. She hadn't known he was dead. Ives. She had been careful not to know things about those people after she left, because knowing meant staying connected, and staying connected meant the life she was trying to build would never fully be hers. She had been so careful about not knowing. He gave you my name, she said. Left it in the system as an emergency access protocol. If he was gone and the documentation needed to surface, the third key went to you. Kowalski looked at her steadily. I think he knew something was going to happen to him. I don't think Decker died accidentally. The monitor beside the bed showed his heart rate climbing not dramatically, but measurably, the body registering what the voice was staying calm about. She nodded it without saying, "Where's the key?" she said. Decker gave it to you in person, Kowalski said. You just don't know that's what it was. Ives. She opened her mouth, then she stopped the challenge coin. Metal worn smooth. She had produced it from her scrub's pocket in the trauma bay and set it on the floor for the dog to scent. And at the time she'd done it, because it was the fastest way to carry her scent at a distance, and the fastest way to connect herself to olfactory memory the dog might recognize. Decker had given her the coin. 3 weeks before she left the unit, sitting in a vehicle bay at 4 in the morning, he had pressed it into her hand and said she remembered this with sudden perfect clarity. "Keep this somewhere. You'll always have it." She had thought it was sentiment. She had thought it was Decker being Decker, which was the kind of person who did things that seemed excessive until the moment when they turned out to have been exactly right. A coin. Kowalski looked at her. What coin? I set a coin on the floor in the trauma bay for the dog to scent. She reached into her scrub's pocket. The coin was still there. She'd pocketed it when she'd moved the dog to the wall, and she'd been too focused on everything else to think about it. She held it in her palm, metal worn smooth on one side, the standard unit challenge coin imagery she'd always assumed it was, on the other side, which she'd never examined carefully, because she'd had no reason to a series of marks that she had always interpreted as decorative. She looked at them now with different eyes. That's the key, Kowalski said quietly. Or part of it. A physical encoding Decker's method. The marks correspond to a decryption string. Why would he give it to me without telling me what it was? Because if you knew, you were a target. If you didn't know, you were just a person with a coin. Kowalski shifted again, pain moving across his face in a wave he controlled but couldn't entirely suppress. He trusted you to still have it 7 years later. He trusted you to still have it. She looked at the coin. She had moved it from apartment to apartment, city to city, through nursing school, and through the first job that hadn't worked out, and through 8 months in this building. It had lived in a small box with a few other things she'd carried out of that chapter of her life, and when she'd shown up for her night shift tonight, she'd put it in her pocket the way she always did. A habit of it so old, she'd stopped registering it as a choice. The door opened. Harlan Voss came in without knocking. He took in the scene: Ellie, Kowalski in the bed, the dog with his head on the mattress, and his expression shifted through several things in quick succession before settling into a kind of controlled professional calm that she recognized as the face people made when they were deciding how to handle something they hadn't anticipated. "Sergeant," he said, "you should have notified my office. You were conscious." I've been conscious for 12 minutes, Kowalski said. "I had things to do." "Yes," Voss said, and looked at Ellie. His eyes went to her hand to the coin, and she watched something register behind his eyes. "I see that." She closed her hand around the coin. Voss looked at her closed hand for one beat too. Then he said, "Miss Potter, I'm going to need you to treat whatever you've just been given as evidence in an ongoing investigation, and I'm going to need you to come with me." "I'm on shift," she said. "Nurse Carter, I have 7 hours left on my shift." "Voss, I have patience." And this, she opened her hand briefly to show the coin, then closed it again. "This is mine. Baker gave it to me, not to you, and I'm going to need a significantly better explanation of your actual authority here before I hand anything to anyone." The temperature in the room dropped slightly. Kowalski made a small sound, not a word, almost a sound of approval, and immediately tried to make it seem like a reaction to pain, which wasn't convincing. Voss said, "You're aware that you're in possession of what may be material to a federal investigation." I'm aware that I'm in possession of something a dead man gave me 7 years ago," she said. "I'm aware that the investigation you're describing is being run by people I have no reason yet to trust. Because Decker is dead, and Vargas is dead, and several other people are dead, and the people telling me to cooperate with standard channels are from the same structure that was issuing the orders. Those people were following." Silence. She had just said very clearly, that she didn't know which side Voss was on. And Voss knew that she knew it, and he was deciding how to respond to it. And in the time he was deciding, she could see him recalculating something significant. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's not an accusation, she said. It's an uncertainty. There's a difference. Voss looked at Kowalski. You told her about the operation. I told her enough, Kowalski said. Eyes. She had Decker's key in her pocket, Kowalski said. The system worked exactly the way Decker designed it to work, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Voss stood at the end of the bed with both phones in his jacket and the particular body language of a man who is in a room where the pieces are not where he expected them to be. Then he said, I need to make a call, and walked to the window and turned his back. Ellie looked at Kowalski. He looked at her. Something passed between them, not a word, not a signal. The specific non-communication of two people who know each other well enough to share a conclusion without expressing it. She needed to get the coin somewhere safe before anyone could compel her to produce it. She also needed to figure out and fast whether Voss was someone she could give it to or someone she needed to protect it from. Kowalski's hand moved on the dog's ear, one small specific gesture. She knew that gesture. She had seen it before, as in briefings and in vehicle bays and in the long waiting. That was most of what that work actually consisted of, and the gesture meant, I'll hold here. She stood. Voss was at the window, voice low. Sato wasn't in the room. She didn't know where Sato was, which was its own problem. The surgical nurse she'd passed in the corridor was probably still nearby. I need to use the restroom, she said, to no one in particular. Neither man responded. She walked to the door. In the corridor, she passed the surgical nurse, whose name she noted from the badge was Kimball, smiled the way she had learned to smile when she needed to, seems like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She walked past the elevator, past the restrooms she'd mentioned, to the small dictation room at the end of the west corridor. Empty as she'd expected, desk with a phone, a chair, a cabinet. She closed the door behind her and looked at the coin in her palm. Physical encoding, Decker's method. The marks on the back, she'd had 7 years to look at them, if she'd been curious, and she hadn't been curious. And now she stood in a hospital dictation room at 1:30 in the morning, examining the back of a challenge coin with the concentrated attention of a person trying to understand something quickly. The marks weren't decorative, they were systematic, a grid of small, precise indentations, some deep, some shallow, arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to her without the cipher that would decode it. But the structure of it was clear once she knew to look. Baker had been meticulous. He had been meticulous about everything. She took out her phone and photographed both sides of the coin. 3 different angles, maximum resolution. She sent the photographs to an email address that wasn't her primary one, an account she'd set up in the first year after leaving the unit, an old habit of maintaining backup communication channels that she'd never quite talked herself out of. Then she looked at the coin itself and made a decision. She couldn't take it off the surgical ward without Voss eventually knowing it was gone, and Voss knowing it was gone would escalate the situation faster than she was ready for. She needed time to verify something, anything about Voss's actual authorization and where his reporting chain went. Until she had that, the coin was the only leverage she had, and leverage worked better when the other side knew you had it. She put the coin back in her pocket and went back to room 318. Voss was still at the window, but off the phone. He turned when she came in, and his expression had changed. Whatever the call had produced, it had shifted something in his approach. Nurse Carter, he said. There's someone who'd like to speak with you. He held out one of the phones. She took it. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Clipped with the accent of someone from the mid-Atlantic states who had spent years working very hard to make their voice mean nothing in particular. She gave a name that Ellie didn't recognize, and then she gave a second name, an operational designation, a string of words that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been inside a specific program, and that one Ellie recognized. She recognized it because Rowan Decker had used it once as the name of the oversight body that was supposed to exist to prevent exactly the kind of thing Kowalski had described. An internal accountability structure, independent of the operational chain. The people who were supposed to be watching. You're the mechanism, Ellie said. We prefer, the woman said, but yes. We've been building a case for 14 months. We've been looking for the third key for 8 of those months. We didn't know Decker had placed it until we found a notation in his personal archive 6 weeks ago. A pause. How do I verify you, Ellie said. Not completely, not tonight. The woman's voice didn't change. But I can tell you that Harlan Voss has been working with our office since he took this assignment, that Sergeant Kowalski has been a cooperating source for the past 4 months, and that the people Kowalski is documenting have been watching for the third key to surface. Another pause, which means that this conversation is probably already being flagged on someone else's system, and that the people who killed Vargas are going to know within the next several hours where that key is. Ellie looked at the coin, which no one could see because it was in her pocket. She looked at Kowalski, who was watching her from the bed. Looked at Voss, who was watching her face. "What do you need?" she said. "We need the documentation unlocked. We need it transmitted to our secure server before the people who are looking for it find another way to suppress it. And we need the nurse who has been sitting on the third key for 7 years without knowing it to decide right now whether she's going to help us finish what Rowan Decker started." The room was very quiet. The monitor showed Kowalski's heart rate steady. The dog had his eyes open, watching the door. The dictation room at the end of the corridor was empty again, and the photographs she'd sent were sitting in an email account on a server somewhere waiting. She thought about Rowan Decker pressing the coin into her hand in a vehicle bay at 4 in the morning, and the look on his face that she had interpreted as sentiment and that she now understood had been something else, the look of a man who was already preparing for what he knew was coming. He had trusted her to still have it. He had trusted her to know what to do with it when the time came. She was not ready, and the math was what? The math was, and she had learned a long time ago that the gap between those two things was where everything important happened. "Tell me what the transmission protocol looks like," she said. Voss pulled a small encrypted drive from his jacket pocket and set it on the bedside table between them. And somewhere in the hospital, below them and beyond them, a door opened that she hadn't heard coming, because Sato had not been in the room when she returned from the dictation room. And she had noted that and filed it under things to address, and she had not yet addressed it. Her phone buzzed from the ER floor, a text. 3 words, none. Asking for you, not Voss's men, not the police sergeant, not the investigators. Would have said their names if she'd recognized them. X-men asking for you, present tense plural, unnamed. At Kowalski, he was already looking at her. He had seen the text without her turning the screen. He had been watching her face, which told the same story. "We have a problem," she said. And from the corridor outside room 318 came the sound of footsteps that were moving too fast and too deliberately to be hospital staff making rounds. And from the corridor outside room 318 came the sound of footsteps that were moving too fast and too deliberately to be hospital staff making rounds. Voss heard it too. He moved before she did to the door, hand against the frame, listening. Body language changed completely in the space of 2 seconds. The DoD investigator packaging falling away to reveal something underneath that was considerably more operational. He looked back at her and at Kowalski and made a small gesture with his hand low flat, the universal meaning of stay. She didn't stay. She moved to the wall beside the door out of the direct sight line of anyone coming through it and pulled the dog with her. The dog was already in the compressed alertness. She'd been monitoring all night, ears forward, weight shifted to his front legs. She put her hand on his back and felt the tension there like a held breath. "How many?" she said, barely a sound. Voss held up 2 fingers. Then he tilted his head. Maybe more. Kowalski was trying to sit up. She could see him in her peripheral vision, the controlled grimace of a man overriding significant physical pain to get his body vertical. And she understood the instinct and understood that he was attached to an IV pole and a monitoring unit and had been out of surgery for less than 2 hours. "Don't," she said in the same low register. "I'm not going to lie here," he said. "I have a drain in your femoral repair and 3 stitched wound sites. If you pull any of those lines, Whitfield is going to be the least of your problems." She kept her voice flat and practical, because that was the register that got through to people like him, people who defaulted to physical action when the situation called for it. "The asset right now. Let us work." He stopped trying to sit up. He didn't look happy about it. The footsteps slowed outside 318 and stopped. Voss stepped back from the door, 1 step 2, and positioned himself to the hinged side. He had his hand at the back of his jacket, which confirmed what she'd suspected. The measured professional was also armed, which was information she filed immediately and would process later. The door opened. The first man through was broad-shouldered, dressed in business casual clothing that was doing less work than he thought to make him seem like a hospital visitor. And he had the particular quality of physical awareness in the doorway, before his eyes finished sweeping the room, that she recognized from a context that had nothing to do with hospitals or insurance adjusters Whatever cover these men were nominally operating under. Athens. He was looking for Kowalski. He found Kowalski in the bed, and the fraction of a second that his attention settled, there was the fraction that Voss used. Voss moved fast for a man his age and efficiently, and the result was that the first man was up against the wall with his right arm at an angle it wasn't designed for before he had fully processed entering the room. He made a sound more surprise than pain, though pain was also present, and the second man in the doorway pulled up short. Athens. The second man was holding something that was not a weapon and was not nothing. A phone extended forward, recording or appearing to record. Federal investigators, the second man said, and his voice had the practiced flatness of someone reciting something they'd rehearsed. We have authorization to access this patient. Let me see the credentials, Voss said, without releasing the first man's arm. You're going to want a credentials, Voss said. The same word, the same tone. Escalation in it, but also no give. Man looked past Voss and found Ellie against the wall. Eyes moved to the dog. Something calculated moved across his face. Next, Carter, he said. You're in possession of material that belongs to an active investigation. I need you to produce it. Which investigation, she said. I'm not at liberty to specify, then I'm not at liberty to produce anything. She kept her hand on the dog's back. Who authorized your access to this ward? That's not something I need to answer to you. You're in a restricted medical ward at 2 a.m, claiming investigative authority without showing credentials to the federal officer who's asking for them, she said. So either you show what you have or this becomes a significantly more complicated situation for you. The second man was still holding the phone forward. She looked at it, at the angle of it, the way he was holding it, and understood that he wasn't recording. He was reading something instructions, maybe, or waiting for a signal. Her own phone buzzed again. She didn't look at it. Athens. The first man, still pinned by Voss, said something quiet to his partner in a language that wasn't English, and the partner's expression changed in a way that told her the situation they'd walked into was not the situation they'd been briefed on. Out. Take said to Voss. He looked at her briefly. Out of this room, she said. I need 5 minutes. Voss assessed the two men, assessed the situation, and made the same calculation she'd made. He said, we're going to the corridor. To the first man. And to the second. After you. His hand moved to his jacket in a way that communicated something without requiring him to say it. The second man looked at Ellie one more time. She looked back at him, and she kept her face entirely still, and after a moment he turned and went into the corridor. The door closed. She went to Kowalski. The phone Voss gave me, she said. The woman on the other end of the office. How do I reach her directly? There's a contact in the encrypted drive, he said. His voice was thin. He was burning energy he didn't have on staying present. Voss put on the table activation code as the last 4 digits of the unit designation. You know that number, she did. She had not thought about it in years, but she knew it the way she knew her own name. It had been spoken too many times in too many briefings to have faded. She picked up the drive from the bedside table and plugged it into her phone. 5 minutes is optimistic, Kowalski said. I know, she said. Stop talking and conserve. The drive prompted for an activation code. She entered the 8 digits she knew. A file directory opened, not large, efficiently organized, the kind of structure that someone had designed for use under pressure. Contact file. First entry, she called it, rang once. Voss. You're not, the woman said. No, they sent people to the ward. Take them. 2 of Voss is managing them in the corridor, and I have maybe 3 minutes before that situation either resolves or doesn't. She kept her voice low and level. 5. I need to know how to get the documentation to you. Now. Without waiting for Voss to walk me through the protocol. A brief silence, the sound of rapid assessment, not hesitation. 5. Has a transmission folder, the woman said. Pop the coin image in the folder. The encoding on the coin is the final key. Our system will decrypt the package automatically once it receives it. Take the photographs I took. Will those work, or do you need the physical coin? There's silence. Longer. High resolution. 3 angles. That should, yes. If the resolution is sufficient, yes. The woman's voice had changed slightly, not warmer exactly, but less managed. You sent them somewhere safe? Already done. She was already navigating back to her email account. I'm pulling them up. Transmission folder is labeled archive. All 3 images. Do not close the application until it confirms. Found the folder. She opened her email, found the photographs she'd sent 40 minutes ago, downloaded them to her phone. Her hands were steady. She'd noticed years ago that her hands were always steadiest when the situation was worst, which was a feature she was grateful for and did not entirely understand. She dropped the first image into the archive folder. A progress bar appeared. thin and green, moving faster than she expected. Eyes. From the corridor, she could hear voices, Voss's measured tone, and underneath it, the slightly higher register of someone trying to assert authority they weren't sure they had. Escalating. Not yet. Second image, third. Progress bar. Completed on all three. And a small confirmation prompt appeared, not text. She'd seen in any standard application a proprietary format, and she pressed confirm. And for 3 seconds, nothing happened. And then the drive's indicator light, which had been blue, turned white. Confirmation received. The woman said on the other end of the still connected call, "The package is unlocking. It'll take 8 to 12 minutes to fully transmit. Remove the drive until the indicator returns to blue." Understood. Ellie said, "Miss Carter," the woman paused. "When this transmits, there are people who are going to know immediately that it happened. The two men in the corridor above them. The kind of people who have enough authority to make this complicated before our office can fully act." Complicated. They're going to attempt to discredit the source. Standard suppression. They'll say the documentation was fabricated, that the chain of custody was compromised, that Kowalski had a personal motive. Another pause. They'll also say that you don't have the authority or the credibility to have authenticated the key. That you're a first-year trauma nurse who stumbled into something she didn't understand. Ellie looked at the drive's indicator light, still white, still transmitting. "Let them say that," she said. The corridor outside 318 had acquired 2 more people in the time she'd been inside the room. Sergeant Decker, the police officer who had apparently not gone home, and Kimball, the surgical nurse, who was standing with the practiced protective posture of someone who has decided that a patient on her ward is not going to be disturbed, and has made this decision without entirely knowing why. The 2 men were still there. The first one was rubbing his shoulder with the expression of a man who was recalculating his evening. The second one had put the phone away. Voss looked at Ellie when she came out. His eyes went to the drive in her hand, then back to her face, and she could see him reading the situation and finding his way to the conclusion. He said, "Transmitting," she said, 8 minutes. He exhaled, not dramatically, just a controlled release of something that had been held. He turned to the 2 men. "You're going to tell me who sent you here, and you're going to do it without the language I don't speak." The second man said, "We represent a principals committee that has oversight of the program. Sergeant Kowalski is associated with," Voss said. I'm not asking for your name," Voss said. "I'm asking for the name of the person who sent you to this ward tonight to retrieve evidence from a private individual. It's a federal question, not a courtesy question, and I'd like the answer." The second man looked at the drive in Ellie's hand. "The drive whose indicator light was still white," he said a name. I didn't know it. But she watched Voss hear it, and she watched something happen behind his eyes. The specific reaction of a person hearing a name that confirms a suspicion. They would have preferred to remain a suspicion. "That's that again," Voss said. The man said it again. Voss took out one of his phones and made a call, 3 words spoken quietly away from the group, and then he came back and looked at Ellie and said, 8 minutes. 8 minutes, she confirmed. Sergeant Decker, who had been standing with his arms folded, and the expression of a man absorbing a significant quantity of information he hadn't been briefed on, said, "Do I need to call anyone?" "Not yet," Voss said. "But stay close." Decker nodded, as if this were a reasonable answer to a reasonable question which said something about the kind of police officer he was. The second man made another attempt, something about protocol, about the appropriate channels for transmitting sensitive material, jurisdictional authority, and Ellie stopped listening after the first sentence, because it was the language of a person building a record for an argument they were going to make later, not a person who expected to win now. She understood that instinct. She had seen it before in people who were operating from a position of eroding power and were laying the groundwork for the fallback position. The drive in her hand was still warm. She stood in the corridor with the dog at her side and the white light transmitting and the institutional quiet of a surgical ward at 2 in the morning around her, and she thought about Rowan Decker in a vehicle bay, pressing a coin into her hand, and she thought about the 4 years she'd spent doing work she'd never fully be able to describe, and she thought about the 8 months she'd spent being overlooked by people who saw a young nurse with limited experience and made their assessments accordingly. She did not think yet about what happened next. That was a problem for after the light turned blue. Turned blue at 2:23. She looked at it for a moment before she said anything, just to be sure, and then she said done and disconnected the drive from her phone and held it out to Voss. He took it. The office has confirmation? Yes. He put the drive in his jacket pocket and looked at the 2 men. You're going to come with me, he said. and you're going to answer a significant number of questions. And I'd strongly recommend you start thinking about which parts of tonight you want to characterize as following orders and which parts you want to characterize as independent initiative, because that distinction is going to matter to the people you'll be talking to. The second man's carefully managed expression finally broke, not dramatically, but the controls slipped, showing something underneath that was closer to what the situation actually called for. You don't understand what you're disrupting, he said. I probably don't understand all of it, Voss said. That's what the several days are for. He walked them toward the elevator, Decker falling in alongside with the quiet authority of someone who understands that his presence is doing work without requiring him to speak. Kimball watched them go with the expression of a woman filing information for future reference. Ellie leaned against the corridor wall and let herself be still for a moment. The dog sat on her foot. He'd been doing that periodically throughout the night, not seeking attention, just using her as a reference point. The way working dogs do when they're in a prolonged situation and they need to maintain their orientation without breaking their focus. At him. The woman from the office called back at 2:31. Transmission complete, she said. 14 years of operational records, 2 missions with documentation of unauthorized target substitution, and 3 years of intercommunications from a principals committee that was supposed to be providing oversight and was instead using its position to direct operations for private benefit. A pause. Enough. It's more than enough. What happens now, Ellie said. Our office files. With the Inspector General within 24 hours. And coordinated with 3 other agencies who have been building parallel cases without the final key. The people named in the documentation will be notified of the investigation, which means there will be an attempt to manage the narrative before the formal findings are released. Another pause. Including managing the narrative about you, you mentioned that. I want to be direct about what that looks like. They will attempt to establish that you were not a credible authenticator of the key. They may raise questions about your service record, your departure from the unit, the circumstances of your exit. The woman's voice was careful, precise. Is there anything in those circumstances that you would want our office to be prepared for? Ellie looked at the coin in her palm. She'd taken it back out of her pocket, habit, something to hold. My departure was voluntary and documented, she said. After a mission where my team took casualties, including the handler who originally worked with the dog I managed tonight. I was not asked to leave. I chose to reason of record. Qualified for it. Honestly, she paused. I was done. After what happened on that mission, I was done. And I knew I was done. And I was honest about it. That's a cleaner record than most. The woman's tone had shifted again by a small margin, but Ellie was listening carefully. There's one more thing. The principals committee named in the documentation includes people at several levels, and 2 of those people have connections to Hargrove Memorial Hospital. Ellie straightened, not medical staff, the woman said quickly, at administrative board level. A procurement relationship that was being used as a secondary funding channel. Hospital. Ellie said this specific hospital, one of several institutions that appears in the financial documentation, as a pass-through, a pause, which may be why Kowalski came here specifically. The thought about that, the particular precision of it, Rowan choosing this city, this hospital, this place where she had been working for 8 months in deliberate unremarkability, and understood that the things she'd attributed to coincidence were not coincidences. Baker had not pointed Kowalski to her by accident. Kowalski had not ended up in her trauma bay by accident. Whoever had sent the 2 men to room 318 tonight had connections to this building that meant the situation was not as contained as the corridor outside room 318 suggested. At the board level, she said, our office is still identifying the full scope. But the name that appears most prominently in the financial documentation is the chair of Hargrove Memorial's Administrative Oversight Committee. She waited. A man named Warren Price, the woman said. Had heard that name once in 8 months at a staff orientation meeting, a photograph on a wall, the kind of institutional figurehead who exists in the background of large organizations as a name attached to a title. She had not thought about him. Since he has no idea the documentation has been transmitted, the woman said. Our office. We'll be coordinating with the U.S. Attorney in the morning. But tonight in that building, if he has any access to information about what happened in that room, he'll know the key surfaced, Ellie said. He won't know if the transmission succeeded. Correct, which means he may attempt to intervene before morning. That is our concern, yes. She looked at the drive indicator, light blue and quiet now, and at the coin in her palm and at the door to room 318, where Kowalski was alone with his monitoring unit and his surgical repairs and a dog who would not leave his side. I need to make a call, she said. She called Reyes. Ana Reyes answered in 2 rings, which meant she was still at the nurse's station and not in a patient room, and her voice had the quality of someone who had been waiting to hear back. The men who asked for me, Ellie said. What did they look like? Hospital administration. Or at least they said so. One of them showed a badge for the administrative office. The other one. I didn't like the other one. Reyes's voice dropped. He asked specifically which floor you were on, not which department. Which floor? What did you tell him? I told him you were managing a critical patient and I'd pass a message, Reyes said. But Carter, one of them, went toward the elevator before I finished talking. He didn't wait for the message, the elevator that went to the 3rd floor. The administrative wing was on the 4th, but there were stairwells, and there were service corridors, and a man with a hospital administration badge had access to both. She said. I need you to do something, and I need you to do it right now, and not ask me why until later. Reyes said. Call the hospital security office and report an unauthorized individual in a restricted clinical area. I'll give them specifics. Just get bodies moving toward the 3rd floor west wing. I'll pause. How much trouble are you in? Less than I was an hour ago, Ellie said. But the night isn't done. She hung up and pushed back into room 318. Kowalski was not in the bed. He was upright, which he should not have been. IV pole beside him like an absurd companion, standing with his weight on his right leg and the left one barely touching the floor, and his face was the color of old paper. And he was looking at the window with the focused attention of a man who has heard something outside a room that has recalibrated his position on lying down and conserving energy. Someone came in through the service corridor entrance, he said. I heard the door, the service corridor, which ran along the exterior of the west wing and connected to the stairwell that bypassed the main nursing station. The dog was at the room door, pressed flat to it, his nose working the gap at the bottom. Get back in that bed, she said. If someone's coming through that Simon. She used his first name without deciding to, and it stopped him the surprise of it, maybe, or something in the way she said it. You're 12 stitches and a drain away from a surgical complication that will end this for both of us tonight. On the bed. I need you vertical tomorrow. Not bleeding out in a hospital room at 2:40 in the morning. He looked at her. She looked at him. The dog's tail moved once slightly at the sound of the tension between them. Then Kowalski got back in the bed. She moved to the room door and put her ear to it, and she heard what the dog had been hearing, footsteps in the corridor, but coming from the wrong direction. Not from the nursing station. From the far end of the west wing, where the service entrance was. She looked at her phone. Voss was 2 floors down. Security was in motion, but not yet. Here Kimball was at the nurse's station, which was around the corner from where the footsteps were coming from. The footsteps stopped outside the room, not outside 318. Door down. She understood what that meant. The person outside was checking numbers or checking a map or confirming they had the right room. People who belonged in this corridor didn't do that. People who belonged here knew where they were going. The handle of room 318 moved. She was already positioned against the wall, and the dog was beside her, and Kowalski in the bed was watching the door with the focused stillness of a man who has learned to make himself a very small target when he has no other options available. The man who came through was not one of the 2 from earlier. He was older, with the administrative bearing of someone who spent their time in boardrooms rather than corridors, and he was holding a phone with the screen lit. And his expression when he found the room not empty in the way he'd expected was the expression of a person whose careful plan has made contact with a reality it didn't account for. He saw the dog first, which was reasonable because the dog was between him and the rest of the room and was not moving. Then he saw Ellie against the wall. Warren Price, she said. She'd pulled his name from 8 months ago, from a photograph at a staff orientation, and she said it with the flatness of a statement, rather than a question, and she watched his face confirm it. He recovered faster than she expected. Nurse Carter, he said, and his voice was boardroom smooth. I was notified that there was a situation on this floor, and I'm here to my life. At 2:40 in the morning, she said through the service corridor. Stop talking. The documentation is already transmitted, she said. 8 minutes ago, the Office of the Inspector General will receive a filing in the morning, including the financial records that document your committee's role in the pass-through operation. She held his gaze. Whatever you came here to do, it's already too late for it. His expression went through several things. She could see him doing the same calculation she'd been running all night, the math of what was recoverable and what wasn't, and she could see the moment he arrived at the answer. His hand moved toward his phone. "The two men from earlier with Voss," she said. "The police officer who's been on this floor all night is in the corridor on the other side of the nurse's station. You are in a restricted clinical area without any authorization that's going to hold up past tomorrow morning." She paused. Take the phone down. He looked at her. The dog had not moved. Growled. Had not done anything except stand between Price and the rest of the room, with the perfect stillness of an animal that has done this before and knows that stillness is more effective than noise. Price's phone stayed where it was, held in his hand lit. I want to speak with legal counsel," he said, and his voice had lost most of the boardroom quality, replaced by something thinner. "You can do that," she said. "You can do that right now with the understanding that anything you say in this room is in front of a federal witness and a patient who is a cooperating source in an active investigation." She gestured at Kowalski without looking away from Price. "Or you can wait 30 seconds for the security team that's currently moving toward this wing." His phone screen went dark in his hand, and then the door behind him opened, and Sergeant Decker came through it with 2 hospital security personnel, and the specific expression of a man who has been told something is happening and has found it. Price turned to look at them. When he turned back, Ellie was watching him with the same expression she'd had when she walked across the trauma bay floor. 5 hours ago, not satisfaction, not triumph, just the focused presence of a person who made a calculation and stood by the result. The security personnel were speaking to Price now, and Decker was on his radio, and in the bed behind Ellie, Kowalski exhaled slowly, the sound of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has just been given a conditional permission to let it go. Ellie looked at the coin in her palm. Rowan Decker had pressed it into her hand 7 years ago and said, "Keep this somewhere, you'll always have it." And she had kept it through every version of herself she'd been in the years since. Through nursing school, and through 3 apartments, and through 8 months of being overlooked in this building, and she had kept it because she'd thought it was sentiment. It had not been sentiment. It had been the most Decker thing imaginable, planning for the outcome he was afraid was coming, and trusting the right person to be in the right place when it arrived. She closed her hand around the coin. From the corridor, she heard Voss's voice. He'd made it back to the 3rd floor, apparently, and he was speaking with the clipped authority of a man who is done having a complicated night and has entered the phase where the paperwork begins. She would have to talk to him again. She would have to talk to a significant number of people in the next several hours, and possibly for several days after that, and the life she'd built around invisibility was going to require significant reconstruction. There was something she needed to do first. She went to Kowalski's bedside. He looked up at her, and he looked exhausted in the way that went past physical. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something too long and is only now beginning to understand that they can stop. "Done," he said. "It's done," she said. He nodded once, and then the controlled steadiness he'd been maintaining cracked, not completely, not dramatically, just a small fracture at the edges that a person who wasn't paying close attention would miss. She was paying attention. The dog put his head on the mattress. Kowalski put his hand on the dog's head, and neither of them said anything, and Ellie stood at the bedside and understood that whatever came next, the investigation, the filings, the depositions, the reconstruction of everything she'd spent 8 months building was going to happen in a context where Warren Price's phone was dark in his hand, and the documentation was out of reach, and the 3rd key had served the purpose Decker had always intended for it. She was putting the coin back in her pocket when Voss appeared in the doorway. He looked at Price being escorted by security. He looked at Kowalski in the bed. He looked at Ellie and at the coin as it disappeared into her scrub's pocket, and he said, "The administrator." "On Price," she said. "He's on the board oversight committee. He's in the financial documentation." Voss looked at the corridor for a moment, at the retreating figure of Price between the security personnel, and she could see him fitting pieces together in real time. "He came here himself," Voss said through the service corridor. Voss was quiet for a moment. "When we filed his name to the U.S. Attorney's office. In the morning, we were going to flag him as secondary. Visibility probably cooperative when approached." He paused. "People who come through service corridors at 3 in the morning are not secondary." "No," she said, "they're not." Voss took out his phone and made a call, and she could hear from the 3 words he said that he was talking to the woman from the office, and from the tone of the conversation that the category of Warren Price in the upcoming filing had just changed. She went back to her shift. Not because there was nothing left to do in room 318, but because Whitfield had appeared in the doorway behind Voss with the expression of a surgeon who has been patient well past his natural limit, and Kowalski needed to sleep, and the dog was already settling beside the bed with the particular quality of an animal who has decided the immediate situation is resolved and has shifted into a longer-term watch. She was at the nurse's station writing her incident notes when Reyes came to stand beside her, coffee in hand, and said nothing for almost a full minute. And the coin in your pocket, Ellie kept writing. I saw you with it in the trauma bay, Reyes said, and in the corridor. And you have it now, yes, Ellie said. Vacant. She thought about Voss on the phone in the doorway, and Price in the security office 2 floors down, and the transmission confirmation on the drive, and the woman from the office saying it's enough. It's more than enough. Most of it. Reyes drank her coffee. What's left? Spalt's Ellie set down her pen and looked at the nurse's station, at the familiar, ordinary surfaces of the place she'd spent 8 months working to belong to, and felt the weight of the answer, not dread. Just the realistic assessment of a person who has been honest with herself for long enough to know what honesty costs. The part where everyone in this building finds out who I am, she said, and decides what to do with that. As Reyes was quiet for a moment, then she said, I already know who you are. Athens. You're the nurse who walked into a trauma bay with a 94-pound military dog about to take someone's arm off, and you fixed it in 45 seconds. That's not all of what I am. No, Reyes said. But it's enough for tonight. Ellie picked her pen back up. She had 3 hours left on her shift and a stack of incident reports that was not going to complete itself. And somewhere on the 3rd floor, a man was waking up to the particular combination of physical pain and professional relief that she suspected he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. She wrote, and the corridor was quiet and the night moved toward its end. And in the administrative office on the 4th floor of a Hargrove Memorial Hospital, Warren Price sat across from a hospital security officer and asked for his lawyer in a voice that no longer had any of the boardroom quality left in it. Sent his phone face up on the table between them, which he'd been required to place there, showed an incoming call from a number that the security officer couldn't identify, but that Price clearly recognized. And the color that left his face when he saw it was the color of a man who has just understood how many people knew his name tonight. He was not allowed to answer it. He was not allowed to answer it. A call rang out, then it rang again. Then the screen went dark, and whatever the person on the other end had intended to say to Warren Price was not said, and the silence in the administrative office had the particular quality of a door closing on something that had been open for a very long time. The security officer, whose name was Tran, and who had been with Hargrove Memorial for 11 years, looked at the phone on the table between them and said nothing. He had been told to hold the individual until further notice and not to let him use personal communication devices, and he was doing that, and he did not need to understand the full context of the situation in order to do his job competently. He had learned this about himself over 11 years, that the full context was rarely his to have, and that doing the immediate work well was its own kind of contribution. Sat with his hands on the table and stared at the dark phone screen, and made the calculation that people in his position always eventually made. Not whether he was going to cooperate, but how much cooperation would cost him, versus how much silence would cost him, and which number was smaller. He had not yet arrived at the answer, but he was doing the math, and Tran could see it in his face, and he was in no particular hurry. Ellie finished her shift at 7:14. 7:14. Because the handoff with the incoming day nurse, a methodical man named Garrett Olson, who took his transition notes extremely seriously, and was not going to be rushed for anyone, ran long. And because she had 2 incident reports that needed supplementary documentation that she had not been able to complete during the night, and because Reyes pulled her aside at 7:02 for a 3-minute conversation that was mostly Reyes confirming what she'd already understood, and one sentence that she hadn't expected. Giles wants to meet with you, Reyes said. Not today. He said whenever you're ready, but he wants to meet. Purpose. Ellie said he didn't specify. But he had a conversation with someone from the DOD office around 4 this morning, and when he came back from that conversation, he went directly to his office and made 2 phone calls, and his expression was Reyes paused. Revised. Revised was the right word. She tucked it away. She took the stairs down and came out through the main lobby, which was beginning to fill with the early morning traffic of a major trauma center orderlies, early visitors who'd been given exceptions for overnight patients. The particular transient population of people sitting in the chairs near the entrance, who had been there since midnight, and had the hollow look of people still waiting for news. She walked through all of it and pushed through the exterior doors and stood in the October morning. At 7 in the morning had a specific quality that she'd noticed in her first week here and had never stopped noticing. The light came in low and sideways, and the air had a sharpness to it that wasn't quite cold yet, but was practicing. The mountains to the west caught the light first and held it, and the hospital parking lot in between was ordinary and exhausted looking, the way places always are when you're seeing them at the end of something rather than the beginning. She sat on the bench outside the main entrance and did nothing for approximately 4 minutes, which was the amount of time she could afford to do nothing before her body started the descent into the particular, exhausted unwinding of a 13-hour shift that had included a federal investigation, 2 unauthorized intruders, 1 recovering special operations sergeant, and a dog. Then she took out the coin and looked at it one more time. She had photographed it, transmitted the photographs, watched the documentation unlock, and transmit to the office that Rowan Decker had apparently trusted with whatever remained of his intentions. She had done what he had set up for her to do 7 years in advance, with the particular meticulous foresight that had always made him the most quietly frustrating person to work alongside, because Decker was never demonstrably the smartest person in the room, but he was always the one who had thought 3 steps further than everyone else and had not mentioned it because he didn't need the acknowledgement. She had not needed the acknowledgement either once. She had been good at the same kind of invisibility. She had built her whole 8 months here on it. She put the coin back in her pocket and went home. The 48 hours that followed were the kind that she could not have prepared for and would not have wanted to. The Inspector General filing happened at 9:17 on the morning after, which she knew because Voss called her at 9:22 to confirm it and to let her know that 4 individuals named in the primary documentation had been formally notified of the investigation. A deputy director, whose name she didn't recognize and whose title meant that his name would be in the news by afternoon, having been placed on administrative leave pending review. Arn Price was not placed on administrative leave. He was suspended from his position on the hospital's board oversight committee, pending an independent inquiry, and his access to Hargrove Memorial's administrative systems was revoked at 11:45 that same morning, which Ellie knew because Reyes texted her about it, with the economy of someone who understood that the recipient did not need surrounding context. Is out effective immediately. Board voted this morning. She was asleep when the text arrived. She read it when she woke at 3 in the afternoon, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with it for a while. Simon, from the office, who had given her name as Marlowe on a follow-up call, which Ellie suspected was not her actual name, but was functional, called at 4. The narrative management attempt started at approximately 8 this morning, Marlowe said. 3 separate communication channels, all pushing variants of the same story, that the documentation chain was compromised, that Kowalski had personal motivations. The authenticating party lacked the credibility or clearance to validate the key. Authenticating party being me, Ellie said. Yes. They found your nursing file. They attempted to use the standard framing inexperienced, no relevant clearance hits, recently hired civilian context to pause. Why not? Because your classified service record was unsealed at 6:45 this morning by request of this office with authorization from the appropriate oversight body. Another pause. Carter. Your service record is, it's not nothing. 4 years of documented field operations, 2 commendations that were classified at the time they were issued, and a medical separation that was filed honestly and approved without contest. Marlowe's voice was careful. The people who tried to use your civilian identity to discredit the authentication walked directly into a wall. Ellie drank her coffee. They're going to know that didn't work, she said. Already. The deputy director's legal team has been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's office since noon. The framing has shifted from the documentation is invalid to my client was acting under directives he received in good faith. Marlowe's tone didn't change, but something underneath it did, a very slight relaxation. The sound of a case that has moved from contested to inevitable. Which is the shift you want to see. It means they've stopped trying to kill the documentation and started trying to position themselves within it. Price is cooperating, Marlowe said, as of this morning. His legal counsel made contact at 10 and indicated full cooperation in exchange for consideration on the financial charges. At the apex of this, he was a pass-through, significant but not the source of pause. He's going to tell us who the source is, and he's going to do it quickly because the people above him are the ones who are going to try to manage the narrative downward in his direction, and he knows it. Ellie looked out the kitchen window at the October street below. Kowalski, she said medically. Yes. His surgical team expects a full recovery with approximately 8 weeks of rehabilitation. He's been formally recognized as a cooperating source, which means he has protections in place. Marlowe paused. Nice. He asked about you this morning whether you'd been briefed. Now I've been. Yes, a longer pause than the ones before. Carter. This office is going to need a formal statement from you, documented, detailed, covering your service history and the circumstances of Decker's coin. To do that in person. Not urgently, but within the next 2 weeks. I can do that, she said. And there's one more thing. Marlowe's voice had shifted into the register of someone who is about to say something they have thought carefully about how to say. Your service record being unsealed means it's now accessible within certain channels. That includes Hargrove Memorial's administrative vetting system, which cross-references staff credentials against military service databases. A pause. Your medical director received a summary this morning. Miles, who had wanted to meet with her whenever she was ready, and whose expression Reyes had described as revised. I see, Ellie said. I wanted you to know before you went back to work, Marlowe said. So you weren't walking in without that information. Thank you, Ellie said, and meant it without ceremony. She hung up and finished her coffee and looked at the ordinary kitchen of the ordinary apartment, because it was close to the hospital and had a parking space and a landlord who didn't ask many questions, and she thought about the word unsealed and everything it meant for the version of herself she'd been trying to maintain. She had built the invisibility deliberately. She had needed it not as a disguise exactly, but as a pressure barrier, a way of keeping the two versions of her life from collapsing into each other before she was ready to manage the result. She had known on some level that the barrier wasn't permanent. Things that are built to contain pressure eventually meet a situation where the pressure is too high, and then you find out whether the structure was strong enough or whether it was just well designed for conditions that no longer exist. The conditions had changed. The barrier was gone. She sat with that for a while, and then she got up and washed her coffee cup, and she started thinking about what she was going to say to Miles. She went back to work 2 days later on the day shift, which was different from the night shift, in the specific way that day shifts always were more administrative presence, more attending physicians, more the institutional machinery visible and in motion. She had requested the switch through Reyes not as a permanent change, just for the week, and Reyes had made it happen without asking why, in a way that suggested she understood exactly why. Miles found her at 9:40 between patients in the corridor outside Bay 3. He said, "Got a minute?" He said, "Yes, sir." And they walked to the small family consultation room, near the main entrance, the room with the neutral-colored chairs and the box of tissues on the table, and the window that looked out onto the parking structure, which was not a pleasant view, but was an honest one. He sat down. She sat across from him. The box of tissues was between them, which neither of them was going to need, but which was doing its usual work of signaling that the room was a place where things got said. "I read your file," he said. "I know," she said. "I should say," he stopped. Uttered again. "I'm not good at this particular kind of conversation. Fine. I'm better with differentials and treatment plans." "I know that too," she said. "You don't have to be good at it. Just say what you're going to say." He looked at the table for a moment. "You spent 8 months in this department taking lower acuity assignments and getting talked over in rounds and being called the new one by people who should have known better. And during that time, you had a service record that most of the attendings on this staff would not have been qualified to access." He paused. "I owe you an apology." "You didn't know," she said. "Oh. But I made assumptions based on what I could see, and what I could see was limited, because I didn't look past the surface of it." His jaw tightened slightly. "It's not good medicine. I know better than that, Dr. Miles." She waited until he looked at her. "You let me approach the gurney." Every instinct in that situation was to hold people back and wait for a more qualified authority. You read the situation, and you made a call. Got it right. He was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't." "Calls almost don't happen," she said. "That's what makes them calls." He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen in the trauma bay, the recalibration, the revision, but it was further along now. Not complete. He'd had 2 days to run the new information through the old framework and arrive somewhere that was more honest than where he'd started. "What do you want?" he said, going forward in this department. Nice. She had thought about this. She had sat with it in the 48 hours in between the calls and the coffee and the slow readjustment of everything she'd built. I want to keep doing what I'm doing," she said. "I'm good at trauma nursing. I'm not going back to the other work. That chapter is finished, and I'm not conflicted about it. But I've been running at half capacity," she said. in my nursing skills, in my willingness to be fully present in what I know. I've been managing myself smaller than I am because I thought that was the safest way to be here." She paused. "I don't want to do that anymore." Miles nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable thing to want. I also have relevant experience in mass casualty triage and field trauma management that your emergency response protocols don't currently incorporate," she said. "I noticed it in my first week. I didn't say anything because I was trying to keep a low profile." Something moved in his expression, a kind of rueful acknowledgement that cost him something but landed honestly. "You have thoughts about the protocol, several." "Of course you do." He leaned back in his chair. "Okay, let's have that conversation. Not today, you've had a significant week, but soon." "I'm free Thursday," she said. He looked at her then, slightly he almost smiled. "Stay," he said. They walked back to the floor together, which was not a grand gesture, just two people returning to work after a conversation that needed to happen. The was busy, and the monitors were tracking, and the ordinary, extraordinary work of keeping people alive was in full motion, and Ellie Carter stepped back into it without breaking stride. Hockey was moved out of the surgical ward on day 4 and into a standard recovery room, which was a significant improvement and which he communicated to her via a text that read, "This bed is worse, but I can see a tree," which was such a specifically Kokolsky sentence that she read it twice and then put her phone away without responding, because the response she wanted to send was not one she was ready to send yet. He visited on day 5. He was sitting up, which was progress. The color was back in his face and the monitoring unit was gone, replaced by a simpler vitals cuff that was doing less work because less work was needed. The dog was not present. Gunnar had been returned to the care of the unit's support team 2 days prior, which was the right call medically and logistically, and which Ellie had known was coming and had felt anyway, in the specific way of things you know, and feel simultaneously and without resolution. Kao looked at her when she came in and said, "You look better." So she said, "You looked like a corpse for about 3 days." "I felt like one." He shifted against the pillows. "Sit down, you're making me anxious standing there." She sat. The room was smaller than 318 and had a view of the parking structure which she recognized from the family consultation room. Apparently had one honest view and redistributed it across multiple windows. "I talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Arlo." "Yes," she paused in Vosvos as he thought about it. "Okay." "He's more okay than I initially thought. He came in carrying directive I wasn't sure about, but he ran it straight once the situation clarified." "That's my assessment too," she said. "A silence comfortable in the specific way of silences between people who have known each other long enough that the silence itself is a kind of conversation." "Becker," she said finally. Kowalski looked at the window. "You knew before you came here, I suspected. A notation in the secure system. The unit connection, I didn't know for certain that you still had the coin." He paused. "I was about 60% sure, which in my line of work is either reckless or cautious depending on the situation. Coming to a hospital bleeding from 3 wounds on 60% certainty is not cautious," she said. "It was reckless," he agreed, "but it was the only option that had a 60%. He turned back from the window. "Talked about you not often, but when the old team came up, which it did, sometimes he'd mention you. He said you were the best field medic he'd ever worked with, and also the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and he said those two things like they were related." She looked at the floor. Something in her chest was doing something she was going to need a moment with, and she didn't have a moment right now, so she filed it in the same place. She filed everything that needed to wait. "He was right on both counts," she said about the stubbornness. "No, Kowalski said I was there for some of it." Almost smiled. "What happens to you now, rehab?" 8 weeks. "Maybe 10. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who knows that's a long time and has accepted it. After that, I don't know yet. The operations running is under review, which means the unit is under review, which means my assignment status is uncertain." He paused. "I'm not sure I want to go back to the same work." That's a reasonable thing to feel after what happened," she said. "Not just what happened. He stopped. It's what Decker knew was happening 2 years before anyone else would acknowledge it, and what it cost him." He looked at his hands. He built the failsafe because he didn't trust the system to correct itself. And he was right not to trust it, and I keep thinking about that, about what it means to work inside a structure that you know is capable of doing what this one did. "It doesn't mean the work itself was wrong," she said. "It means the structure was compromised. Those aren't the same thing." "Is that how you made peace with leaving?" "What about it?" The honest answer, not the available answer. Because I couldn't keep doing the work the way it needed to be done. After we lost the people we lost, she said. I wasn't running from anything corrupt. I was running from something that had broken in me that I didn't know how to fix inside that context. She paused. I fixed it by doing something else. Something that used the same skills in a different direction. Nursing, he said. Nursing, she confirmed. Which everyone here thought was just nursing until last week. Until a 94-pound dog decided you were the only person he trusted, Kowalski said. That, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't regret coming here, he said, in case you were wondering. She hadn't been wondering exactly, but she had been holding space for the question. Good, she said. I regret the part where I got shot 3 times, he added. That part was bad. That part was very bad, she agreed. He almost smiled, and she almost smiled back, and the tree outside the window moved in a wind. She couldn't hear through the glass, and the room was ordinary and honest and sufficient. And she understood that this was what resolution actually looked like. Not a sweeping clarity, not a dramatic arrival, just 2 imperfect people in a small room with a parking structure view, talking, without the weight of all the things they'd been carrying. She stayed for 40 minutes, then she went back to work. The public findings were released 6 weeks later. She was on shift when it happened, day shift bay 2, assisting on a pediatric serration that required more patience than technical skill, and which she had in abundance that morning. She didn't see the news until her break, and she saw it the way most people saw it on her phone, in a break room with bad coffee in the 15 minutes between one task and the next. The Inspector General's report was formal and precise and used the kind of language that institutional accountability produces: restrained, heavily footnoted, careful in its attributions. The substance of it was not restrained. 4 individuals formally referred for prosecution, and others named as persons of interest in ongoing investigations. A deputy director, whose name she now knew from 3 weeks of news coverage, formally charged with directing unauthorized operations and misuse of classified assets. 2 members of a principals committee, including one whose name she did not recognize and one whose name she did, charged with financial crimes and abuse of oversight authority. Price was named in the financial section. His cooperation was noted. His charges were reduced from what they might have been, which was the deal his lawyer had made, which was frustrating in the specific way that deals always were necessary, functional, and imperfect. He had resigned from the board of Hargrove Memorial Hospital on the same morning. The findings were released, the resignation letter, citing personal reasons, which was the language people used when the actual reasons were too specific to be useful. She read the relevant sections in the break room and drank her coffee and felt the particular texture of an outcome that was not clean and not complete, but was real. The people who had used the structure for their own purposes had been named publicly in a document that was going to remain accessible. Becker's records, unlocked from a coin, had become the backbone of a case that 3 separate agencies had been building without the final key. The things that had been done in the dark were in a public document now, and the document had footnotes, and the footnotes had sources, and the sources were airtight because Rowan Decker had been meticulous about everything he'd ever done. She thought about him for a while. She did that occasionally now she'd given herself permission to, which was the part that had been hardest to get to. In the years after she left the unit, she had not let herself think about the people she'd left behind, because thinking about them meant keeping a door open that she needed to close. She had been wrong about that, she understood now. The door hadn't meant she'd finished grieving. It had meant she'd postponed it. Decker had been 31 years old when she last saw him. He would have been 38 now, or 39. She calculated it and then stopped calculating because the number didn't help. He had been meticulous and patient and funny in the dry, understated way of people who have seen enough that obvious seem beside the point. And he had pressed a coin into her hand in a vehicle bay and trusted her with a piece of his plan without ever being able to tell her what the plan was. She had kept it. That was the thing, she had kept it, moved it from apartment to apartment, put it in her pocket every night shift for 8 months, and she had not known what she was keeping, and it had not mattered to the keeping of it. That was something. She thought about what it was for a few minutes, and she thought about the word trust and what it actually required: not certainty, not guarantees, just the decision to believe that the right person would do the right thing when the time came, even if the right person didn't know they were waiting. Becker had trusted her to be exactly who she was. She had spent 7 years being exactly who she was, and he had been right. She finished her coffee and went back to work. 3 weeks after the public findings, Miles scheduled the protocol review meeting. It was a Thursday, as she'd suggested, and it was in the conference room on the second floor, the same one where she'd sat across from Voss and Sato in the middle of the night that everything shifted. She noted, and then set aside because the room was just a room and it was going to be used for other things now. Miles brought Reyes and two other senior nurses and the hospital's emergency response coordinator, a compact, efficient woman named Tessa Pruitt, who had the energy of someone who had been waiting for this kind of meeting for a long time and was not going to waste it. Ellie brought her notes. She had been keeping them since her first week in the small, precise handwriting that predated nursing school, and there were 3 pages of them, not grievances, not criticisms, just observations. Places where the current protocols had gaps, places where field experience suggested a different sequence, places where the assumptions built into the existing procedures did not account for scenarios that were not common but were not impossible, as the night of October 14th had demonstrated. Athens. She walked them through the notes methodically without performance, in the register of someone who knows what they're talking about and doesn't need to prove it. Pruitt interrupted 3 times all 3 times. The interruptions were good questions. Ellie answered them directly and revised 2 of her own points in response, because 2 of the questions identified weaknesses in her proposed adjustments that she hadn't fully accounted for, and being revised by a good question was better than being right in the original draft. Miles was mostly quiet. He listened and he watched Pruitt and Ellie interact, and at the end he said how long to draft the formal revision. If I'm doing it alongside regular shifts, Ellie said. 4. If I have some protected time, I'll find 4 weeks of protected time, he said. I want Pruitt to co-author. Pruitt looked at Ellie. That works, Pruitt said. That works. Ellie confirmed the meeting ended at 11:45. She was back in Bay 1 at 11:55 because the schedule didn't care about protocol revision meetings, and there was a 37-year-old with a suspected pneumothorax who needed her attention more than any administrative process. She worked the pneumothorax and a laceration repair on a 10-year-old who was much braver than he wanted anyone to know, and a consultation on a confused elderly patient who had come in by ambulance and who needed someone to sit with him for 7 minutes and simply be present, which she did, because presence was also a skill, and sometimes it was the skill that mattered most. At 3:30, she got a text from Kowalski, cleared for partial weight-bearing today. Connor is here for a training visit. He sat on my foot for 20 minutes and refused to move. She looked at the text for a moment. Tell him I said he has good judgment, she typed back. Already knows, came the reply. She put her phone away and went back to her patients. The coin lived on her dresser now instead of her pocket. She'd made that change deliberately, about 2 weeks after everything settled, not as a retirement of it, more as a reclassification, as it had served its purpose. It had been a tool, and a key, then a transmission, Athens, and now it was something else. A piece of memory that she had stopped keeping at a distance. Athens, something she looked at in the morning when she got up and acknowledged, and then went about her day. She understood a simple person. She had not simplified by leaving the unit and becoming a nurse. She had not become someone new. She had become someone more layered, more honest about the layers, more willing to let them exist in the same space without requiring one to dominate the other. The person who had done the work she'd done, and the person who drove to work every morning to care for people. She didn't know those were not 2 competing identities. They were the same person at different points on the same line. Was do the work that needs doing with the skills you actually have, in the place you actually are right now. That was all it had ever been. In the field, in the unit, in the trauma bay, in the break room, reading public findings over bad coffee. The work changed, the skills adapted. The place was wherever you happened to be standing when something needed doing. She had been standing in the supply corridor when the radio call came in about Kowalski. She had been standing in the right place with the right background and the right piece of worn metal in her scrubs pocket. And a dog who needed to remember that the person who was always where she was supposed to be had arrived. She didn't think she would have changed anything, even if she'd known at the beginning how the night was going to go. She would not have been less careful. The 8 months of building a quiet, ordinary professional identity had been real, and she didn't regret them. She had needed that time. She had needed to settle into the work of nursing before the complications of her past arrived, and the time had given her that she would change was smaller. She would not have muted herself as thoroughly as she had. She would have offered the protocol observations in month 3 instead of carrying them in silence until someone finally asked. She would have let herself be fully competent in the room instead of managing her competence to a level that wouldn't draw attention. Life. You cannot actually hide what you are. You can delay the discovery. You can choose the circumstances of the revelation. But the thing you are will surface eventually because it comes through in the decisions you make under pressure, and pressure is going to come whether you prepare for it or not. She had spent 8 months preparing for a quiet life, and the preparation had been genuine, and the quiet life had been real. And then pressure had arrived in the form of a military working dog and a bleeding sergeant and a coin. She'd been carrying for 7 years, and she had made the decisions her whole self made, not her careful surface self, and everything that followed had been the consequence of that. Not a bad consequence. A true one. Consequence was just another word for outcome. And the outcome was she was still here doing the work she'd chosen with the whole of herself available to do it. That was enough. That was, if she was honest, more than she'd thought she was building when she applied to nursing school and told herself she was starting over. She wasn't starting over. Nobody starts over. You carry what you're made of, and you find out what that is by watching what happens when things get hard. On a Thursday, in late November, 6 weeks after the public findings and 8 weeks after the night that changed the shape of everything, Ellie arrived for her shift and found Donna Reyes waiting near the entrance with 2 coffees and an expression that said she had been waiting specifically for her. Kowalski is cleared for discharge today, Reyes said, handing her one of the coffees. He asked if you'd be in. I'm in, she said. Also, Reyes hesitated, which was unusual enough that Ellie paid attention. Miles submitted a recommendation to the hospital's clinical leadership committee yesterday for a new position, emergency response clinical lead, with cross-departmental authority during mass casualty and high-complexity events. Reyes paused. He listed you as the recommended candidate. Ellie drank her coffee. He could have asked me first, she said. He was going to ask you today, Reyes said. I may have found out slightly in advance, slightly. The administrative coordinator owed me a favor, Reyes said without apology. Ellie looked at the hospital entrance, the automatic doors, the lobby with its morning population, the ordinary machinery of a place that was always in the middle of something and never fully finished and absolutely required the people inside it to show up and do the work and not wait to be certain before they acted. What's the pay difference? She said, significant, Reyes said. Is it a management position or a clinical position? Hybrid. Miles was specific about that, he said, and I'm quoting because it was memorable. I'm not taking her out of the bays to put her behind a desk. I'm giving her the authority she was already operating with and the title to match. He looked at Reyes. Reyes looked back at her with the expression of a woman who had been running charge in a trauma department for a decade and knew the difference between the people who needed the encouragement and the people who needed someone to just stop getting in the way. Okay, Ellie said. Okay, yes, she said. Reyes nodded once as if this had never been in doubt, which Ellie suspected it hadn't been for Reyes. Kowalski's discharge was at 11. He came down in a wheelchair, the elevator, not the stair, which his surgical team had been firm about with the left leg in a brace and the crutches balanced across his lap, and the expression of a man who was going to be using those crutches correctly for approximately 2 days before. He tried to do something he'd been told not to do. Connor was with him. The unit support team had brought the dog for the discharge, a small thing, not a protocol, just a decision made by someone who understood that some things mattered at the level below policy. The dog saw Ellie before Kowalski did and came to her with the particular directness of an animal that does not perform its feelings but also does not conceal them. She put her hand on his head and he pressed into it once firmly, and then positioned himself beside her in the way he had positioned himself. Since the night she'd walked across the trauma bay and spoken a word from a language she'd learned in a context she'd spent years trying to keep behind glass. Kowalski got himself upright on the crutches and looked at her. 8 weeks of outpatient rehab, he said. I've been told not to rush it by approximately 9 different medical professionals in the past week. They're right, she said. I know they're right, he said, with the tone of someone who has accepted this and not made peace with it and is holding both things simultaneously. You'll be fine, she said. You've been through worse. I've been through worse, he agreed. But the worst things didn't come with this much paperwork. Laughed. She almost laughed. The almost was closer than usual, which was its own kind of progress. Take care of yourself, she said, not in the field medic way, in the actual way. He looked at her for a moment. I'll try, he said. That's the honest answer. That's the right answer, she said. Gunnar pressed his nose briefly against her hand, a single point of contact, the canine equivalent of a sentence that says everything necessary and nothing more. Then Kowalski adjusted the crutches, and the support team fell in alongside him, and they moved toward the exit, and she watched them go. Bobby was ordinary around her patients coming in. Family members waiting, a couple of the day shift nurses crossing in the direction of the elevators, and light coming through the main doors at the low October angle that Spokane specialized in. She stood in the middle of it. She was a trauma nurse at Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Spokane, Washington. She was a former combat medic with a service record that was no longer sealed. She was the person who had walked into a trauma bay 5 weeks ago and changed the shape of everything by doing exactly what she was built to do. She was imperfect and tired and had 3 protocol revision documents due to Pruitt by Friday. And a meeting with Miles at 2 o'clock that was going to change her title and not change her in any way that mattered, because she had already been what the title described. She was not starting over. She had never been starting over. She was continuing carrying forward every version of herself she'd ever been, setting down the parts she'd outgrown, holding on to the parts that still served a purpose, and doing the work that needed doing in the place where she happened to be standing. Automatic doors closed behind Kowalski and the dog. She finished her coffee, put the cup in the recycling, and went to work.